Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast and the Joseph Smith Podcast. I am your host for today, John DeLynn. It's November 3rd, 2025, and today we are in part 21 of our series with Dr. John Turner on this groundbreaking, very important book, Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet, again, by John G. Turner. We want to thank our donors for making all this possible. Please like and subscribe to this channel wherever you listen to it. That helps us with the algorithms. And we have back with us today, John Turner. Hey, John, welcome back.
Hi, John DeLynn. Great to be back with you. Excited for today's conversation. Grateful to everyone who has supported this podcast and who have been listening, commenting, reading. Any of those are always super welcome.
Any quick news or announcements or anything before we jump in?
Well, we could call this the financial advice episode of the Joseph Smith podcast. I'll just say I have a comment in the introduction to my book, which caught some people's attention, which was, I wouldn't trust him with my money, my wife, or my daughter. We'll talk about the latter two in upcoming weeks. And today we're essentially talking about Joseph Smith's leadership, specifically his financial leadership of the church, and really an enormous financial debacle that for a good number of church members called Joseph's leadership into question.
Yes, we are here today to talk about the Kirtland Bank Scandal. We're in chapter 18 of John Turner's book entitled Follies, 1836 to 1837. Last week we covered Fanny Alger. For most, I think it was just an extramarital affair. Sometimes Mormon apologists try to refer to that as Joseph's first polygamous marriage. Today, we're going to talk about the Kirtland Bank Scandal, and I'm going to begin a little bit non-traditionally because I'm going to read kind of the climax of action of this Kirtland Bank Scandal just to give people a teaser for how unchained things become. So this is the bottom of page 198, and it says, at another Sunday meeting in the temple, Joseph Smith Sr. criticized Warren Parrish in relation to the Safety Society, that's the bank. Parrish charged at the church's patriarch. Joseph Sr. called on Oliver Cowdery, who was a justice of the peace, to detain Parrish. Cowdery sat like a statue, meaning did nothing. Before Parrish could pull Joseph Sr. out of the pulpit, William Smith grabbed Parrish and began carrying him toward the door. This is William Smith, who just in the past couple episodes had a melee with his own brother, Joseph Smith. Now he's in a melee with Parrish, grabbing Parrish, pulling him out the door. Dissident apostle, this is an apostle, John Boynton, drew a sword, and threatened to run him through, meaning William, if he took another step. So Mormon apostles are threatening to run each other through with swords. According to Eliza Snow's later recollection, other men drew pistols and bowie knives. A melee ensued, while some church members, quote, tried to escape from the confusion by jumping out of the windows. Was this the temple where this melee was happening?
Yep.
This is in the Lord's house. Okay. And then meanwhile, Joseph and Sydney are needing to flee. And if I'm reading right, do they dress up as women to flee Kirtland, or is that in a different episode?
That is not here. They are actually busy dodging a hostile sheriff in nearby Painesville. Yeah.
Yeah. So Joseph and Sydney are fleeing, hiding in. Oh, here it is. They took refuge in a swamp and lay down next to an old log. that's how. I mean, and it's so ironic because just a couple episodes ago, we had the Kirtland Temple. We called it Pentecost dedication, where like basically they're pretty much at Zion at that point, right, John Turner?
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's just surprising how quickly everything fell apart, right? Because there were these months in which Joseph is instilling this decorum and order and hierarchy, and then a year later it all goes to shambles. And yeah, it's a reversal of fortune, to be sure.
Yeah. So, all right. So, of course, this podcast is best consumed chronologically. We provide it in a playlist on YouTube, the Joe Smith Podcast playlist on the Mormon Stories Podcast channel. Go, if you haven't watched the previous episodes, go back and watch it. We're also providing it as a standalone podcast on Spotify and on Apple Podcast, or you can pick and choose and find these episodes in the traditional Mormon Stories Podcast stream. All right, John Turner. So maybe let's start out today with the financial shape the Kirtland Temple left Joseph Smith and the church in. Is that okay?
Absolutely, because Joseph felt increasing financial desperation, and partly because of that, did increasingly desperate things to try to solve financial problems. And that is the root of a lot of the folly that we're talking about this week. So, yeah, you're right. A couple of episodes ago, we talked about the soaring success of the completion of the Kirtland Temple, but that came at a steep price. Joseph and the church leaders more generally had to borrow a lot of money to pay for the temple's construction. The exact figures are uncertain, but according to reasonable estimates, church leaders were $13,000 or $14,000 in debt at the time of the building's completion. Joseph and other associates had additional debts as well. So once Pentecost is over, Joseph partly has to switch his attention to, how do I meet these debts? How do I pay these bills? And, the church has been growing, but bringing in a large amount of money in a relatively small period of time, that is a real challenge for Joseph Smith. And typically, when people borrowed sums of money back in the 1830s, there's often a steep repayment expectation. So you might pay everything back in 1, 2, or 3 years. There weren't any, 10 or 30-year bonds like institutions typically do today. So financial pressure could stack up really quickly.
Okay, so Joseph's feeling the heat, trying to find a way out, and you talk a lot in this chapter about Andrew Jackson and a larger climate around banking, and I'll even call it anti-banking in the United States in the 1830s. What's wrong with the bank? Why would the president of the United States be viewed as anti-bank? And what was the banking climate just in general?
Sure. So the banking climate by the mid 1830s was pretty much chaos. So today, if you have some paper money in your wallet, it's all from it's all the United States government. That's the source of those banknotes. In the 1830s, things were far more complex. There had been a Bank of the United States, but then also states chartered banks, which issued their own paper money. Some businesses simply put their own banknotes into circulation. Some people would start banks without any sort of government charter and would just sort of set up shop and start issuing currency. So it was very complex. The Bank of the United States had maintained some check on this chaos because they essentially forced state chartered banks to keep some hard money, meaning silver and gold, on hand in order to redeem banknotes. And I realize this is going to get a little bit into the weeds, but I think this is an important point. If you have in your wallet a $1 bill, that piece of paper itself is the dollar. If you look at a banknote from the 1830s, such as those of the Kirtland Safety Society, it'll say something like, the Kirtland Safety Society will pay the bearer of this note $1 on demand. Essentially meaning, if you have that banknote and you give it to the bank, they'll give you the equivalent dollar in silver or gold. So I think it's pretty hard for us who are used to, simply seeing paper money and thinking of it at face value. And a lot of us, we don't even do that anymore. We're just making electronic payments and with our credit cards. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around how chaotic banking and paper money were in the mid 1830s.
And why was Andrew Jackson seemingly running around trying to get banks to fail? Or did I read that wrong? So it's almost like he was causing banks to fail by his monetary policy.
Yeah. So Jackson objected to the power that the directors of the Bank of the United States could wield. So in his mind, the Bank of the United States essentially arrogated to itself the power to destroy state-chartered banks as it saw fit. And so Jackson objected to that concentration of financial power. Also, Jackson, and a lot of the Democratic Party, they preferred hard money, gold and silver, to paper money. So there was a wing of the Democratic Party as a whole that objected to the whole concept of paper money and favored gold and silver. Jackson's main beef with the Bank of the United States was its concentration of financial power.
Okay, and I know we're really getting in the weeds, but I think it's important so that we can understand what happens. I don't know that we always think of banks as like businesses, but basically you start a bank, you hopefully have some assets there, and then you ask people to give you their money and store it in the bank. You keep track of how much money they put in. Maybe you promise them some return on the investment, but then the bank doesn't just keep all that money in the bank and store it to keep it safe, which is one of the functions of the bank. It sounds like they also will either loan that money out to other people to get interest, to make money off the interest, or invest that money to get a return. And so the bank is trying to make money by collecting assets, keeping enough to keep the bank solvent, but then investing in either loans or in other investments to just try and gain a profit, right?
Correct. Yeah. Banks definitely didn't exist to protect your money. They existed to make money. And, in short, one way that a bank could make money would be to put banknotes into circulation as a form of loan. And if people in the surrounding area had confidence in the bank's ability to meet its obligations and to be able to redeem those notes for gold and silver, then those banknotes were, the word is current, where we get our word currency. People had confidence in them. You can buy and sell things with those notes. And as long as people had confidence in the bank, that worked just fine. If people lost confidence in the bank, or their confidence in a bank wavered, that's when things became chaotic and dangerous, because then anyone who would have that bank's notes would go to that bank as quickly as possible, demand their silver and gold. And if an institution ran out of its reserves of specie, of gold and silver, then it would collapse.
Okay, so specie means assets held at the bank by the bank, that would allow people to have confidence that enough of a percentage of the deposits are being held at the bank, such that if a certain percentage, not all of the people who've kept their savings at the bank needed to get it back, there'd be enough to satisfy the average or even heightened demand of the people banking with the bank. Is that right? The customers.
No, that's correct. And typically, if a local bank was well run, people in the vicinity would have confidence in its banknotes. And if a bank had a more impressive balance sheet and a larger profile, its notes might circulate at a wider radius. So the whole system depended on confidence of individuals in particular banks, and in the late 1830s, in the banking system in general.
Okay. I think that gives us enough of a sense. Do we know if there was a bank in Kirtland at the time that Joseph, I guess, and God presumably decided to start a bank there? Was already a bank there?
That's a great question. I don't think so. I believe, I know church leaders, and I think Kirtland's residents more generally, they relied on the Bank of Geauga, so for Geauga County, which was in nearby Painesville. And that was actually an interesting situation. One of that bank's directors was Grandison Newell, who had financed Philastus Hurlbut's campaign against Joseph and the church. So you essentially had a situation in which Kirtland residents were dependent on a bank that was not friendly to them. Now, that Bank of Geauga did extend credit to Joseph and his associates, but I think one can understand why Joseph might think that Kirtland needed its own bank and currency, so they could essentially take, greater control of, their own economic interests.
Okay. I have it here just at the top that September 11th, 1836 was an important date. Let's get that out of the way, because I think it's at least worth noting. Why are we noting September 11th, 1836 in this chapter?
So September 11th, 1836, back in 1834, I think this actually stretches back to 1831, but in 1834, Joseph had, in the wake of the Zion's Camp March, he had prophesied that Zion would finally be redeemed on September 11th, or by September 11th, 1836. It related to an earlier revelation that Kirtland would be a stronghold of Zion or something like that for 5 years, which was given back in 1831.
And how'd that work out?
Well, it didn't work out well. In fact, the Mormon settlers in Missouri were in this spring and summer of 1836. They were under renewed duress. So back in 1833, when the Mormons had been expelled from Jackson County, many of them took refuge in neighboring Clay County, just to the north of Jackson County over the Missouri River. And as they established themselves there, although they had at first been more or less tolerated as refugees, within a couple of years, their numbers had grown, and non-Mormons in Clay County wanted them to move on. And anti-Mormon committees and groups formed. And in the summer of 1836, Mormon settlers in Clay County agreed to leave. And they reorganized themselves further to the north in a less populated part of Missouri.
So if Joseph made the promise that by September 11th, 1836, Zion would be redeemed, were there members who held him accountable or said, hey, you promised this, we've been waiting around? Or was there any accountability to Joseph for the prophecies that he made with dates attached?
Yeah, I would say not in this case, John. And I would think a lot of church members would have remembered those predictions. There also was, a lot of rhetoric at the time of the Kirtland Temple's dedication that if any more church members were driven from their lands, the saints would not rest until they were avenged. And then, just a couple of months later, the saints are essentially again driven from a county. And there's not much of a response from Joseph Smith. He essentially endorses the decisions that Missouri leaders, church leaders have made. And I would say there's not a closer or more vociferous engagement on the prophet's part.
So I guess we're learning that humans who are following someone who claims to be a prophet have a very high threshold for continued devotion, even if and when some or many prophecies just aren't fulfilled. Humans have a very high believing religious humans have a very high resilience to keep demonstrating devotion even after multiple prophecies just don't come true.
Well, I think that's true. I think also church members throughout this whole sort of sequence of conflicts in Missouri, when things go south, they don't blame Joseph Smith for a false prophecy. They blame their enemies for persecuting them. And
or maybe themselves for not being righteous enough sometimes, maybe.
I mean, I think a number of Joseph's revelations and statements go in that direction. I don't know whether very many of the saints buy into that thinking. I'm thinking they blame their enemies.
Got it. Okay, that's. I'm glad we mentioned that. So, where did the idea for the Church of Jesus Christ? Is it the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by this point? I lose track.
I think at this point we're getting to the point where it's the Church of the Latter-day Saints.
Okay.
I think it's 1838 that you first see what becomes the full name of the church.
Okay. So where did the idea for the Church of the Latter-day Saints to create a bank in Kirtland or a safety society come from? Was it revelation from God? Was it just Joseph's idea? Combination of the two?
Great question. So maybe to tell a little bit of an additional story. So Joseph has this pressing need to meet these financial obligations by the summer of 1836. At the end of July, he leaves Kirtland in the company of Oliver Cowdery, Sidney Rigdon, maybe one or two other folks. And they travel to New York and then ultimately to Salem, Massachusetts. And the reason for going to Salem is super curious. Joseph apparently has gotten a tip from a church member that there's a house in Salem with a valuable treasure in its cellar, a large amount of money, maybe, a pile of silver, something like that. And Joseph believes, or is led to believe, that if he can acquire that property, he's going to get the treasure and solve his money problems in short order. And so in a way, this is an 1836 treasure quest, which also doesn't pan out. According to what Joseph writes Emma, he is able to identify the house. It's uncertain whether they are able to buy or rent it, but they leave New England without any treasure chest or pile of money. So
even though he received a revelation that he should go get it, right?
So it's interesting. So there's a revelation that he dictates that the Lord has much treasure in this city for them. Concern not yourselves about your debts, for I will give you power to pay them. And I think, the literal reading of that revelation is you're going to get the treasure, which, that turns out not to be the case. I think it's during this trip that Joseph, Oliver Cowdery, and the others discuss the idea of starting a bank. It's not clear to me if the idea originates from Joseph, Oliver, God, but by the time Joseph and company are back in Kirtland, they are ready to move forward with the bank idea. Joseph sends Oliver Cowdery and Hiram Smith to New York City to purchase a safe and to purchase printing plates. They start finding investors for this bank, and they're essentially ready to start their operation by the end of the year.
That treasure digging expedition in Boston, it almost feels like he's falling back on his old ways out of desperation to try and fix a financial problem. Is that a unfair, uncharitable way to kind of interpret that?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't think the methods are the same that Joseph used back in the mid 1820s. So as far as I know, he's not looking into his seer stone to trying to find out where the house is, though you never know. It's always possible. I think it really simply speaks to Joseph's desperation. So this church member tells him, hey, there's this house in Salem. There's this money in the cellar. And if you can acquire the house, you're going to get the money. And, if I told you, John DeLynn, there's this house in Cedar City. If you can get it, I don't know exactly where it is. It's in this neighborhood, but ask around. And if you can get it, you'll have $1 million. You might think it was worth the trip, but you might also be more financially prudent than Joseph Smith. I don't know.
But God endorsed the expedition, right? So is that right? So, I mean, there's divine sanction of the expedition.
There is divine sanction.
Yeah.
So the Lord says that he's not displeased that they've come, that there's treasure in this city for them, and promises that they're going to be able to pay their debts. They shouldn't be, they shouldn't be concerned about them. They should have faith.
And this is all on the heels of the Fanny Alger scandal breaking out, which we covered last episode with Emma and Oliver and maybe a few others, exposing Joseph in a likely adulterous affair, correct?
That's my interpretation. And whatever transpired between Joseph and Fanny, I think it definitively ends when Joseph leaves on this trip to New York and New England. So by July 25th, 1836. So Joseph really has his hands full. There are troubles for the church in Missouri, to which I don't think Joseph really gives his full attention. There's the fallout from Fanny Alger. And then there's this financial pressure in Kirtland.
It almost gives the vibes of like a Hollywood movie, sort of like bank heist. It's like they know that this house has treasure, but it's currently occupied. And don't they end up renting it or buying it to get access? I almost expected them to break in at night and try and break into the cellar to find the treasure. It seems kind of like a fool's errand, but also kind of comical. But clearly, it was serious to them, or they wouldn't have been spending their time this way.
Yeah, no, it is. It is kind of comical, and I think also a little erratic, right, on Joseph's part. I think that would be fair to say. So he writes Emma in mid-August, "We have found the house, but the house is occupied, and it will require much care and patience to rent and buy it." And within a couple of weeks, they're on the road. So they apparently didn't have that much patience. According to Ebenezer Robinson, who was a church member at the time, who was reasonably close to Joseph Smith in the mid-1830s. He wrote an account of this many decades later. He suggests that Joseph was able to rent the house and failed to find any treasure, but I think it's uncertain. It may be that they just gave up and left and headed back to Kirtland.
Yeah, and I'm almost getting the sense that Joseph's got his colleagues saying, "We're in debt. What are we going to do?" And the scandal with Fanny Alger happens. It's in Joseph's mind, man, I got to get out of town, and let's go try and find some money. And maybe he's stalling. Maybe he's just avoiding the drama back at home. It does seem like a fool's errand, and a get rich quick scheme, which I think the Mormons have a reputation for pursuing, even to this day, in terms of the MLM stuff that seems to happen a lot in Utah. So it's interesting, kind of foreshadowing of at least our culture's affinity towards get rich schemes a little bit sometimes. I thought it was interesting what he writes to Emma in that letter on the top of page 199. Do you want to read that, John Turner?
Sure. So he writes, "Believe me that I am your sincere friend and husband." I think that's the conclusion of one of Joseph's letters to Emma Smith from Salem, Massachusetts, where they're looking for this house and money. So my interpretation of that, and I would readily concede I may be reading into it, is that it reads a bit like a plea for forgiveness. I do think it seems that by the time Joseph gets back to Kirtland, there's no particular evidence of ongoing strain in their marriage because of Fanny Alger. There is strain for the household by the following spring, but that seems to be because of financial and legal pressure rather than conflict between Joseph and Emma.
Yeah. Okay, so they leave Salem. Some people find it interesting that Joseph spent some time learning about the Salem witch trials. Is that right? And is that interesting to you, John Turner?
Well, I always like those little details, of what people are doing with their spare time. And basically they're in Salem for a few weeks. I think, they may have done a little bit of preaching, though possibly Sidney Rigdon more than Joseph. So they go to the East Indian Marine Society Museum. They went to see Witch Hill, as it was known, where victims of the 1692 witchcraft trials had been hanged. They also went to see the remains of a Catholic convent that a mob had burned down several years earlier. So yeah, they're kind of in a way they're killing time as they try to figure out where this house and treasure are. So, they take advantage of being somewhere new, different, and interesting.
I imagine there wouldn't have been a Salem Witch Trial Museum back in the 1830s.
I don't think you could do a ghost tour at night, or that whole industry of Salem hadn't quite come into being yet.
Julia's mentioning that maybe Joseph had in his ancestors people who participated in the Salem witch hunts, I guess. But really quickly, what would have been the public perception of those witch trials back in the 1830s? That it was sort of like a moral panic where they really weren't witches, but women were just being falsely accused by men with false supernatural claims? Or would it have been like, whoa, there were really witches and wow, good thing they all got killed? Do you have a sense for what the common perceptions of the witch trials would have been back in the 1830s?
So I am pretty confident that in the 1830s, the perception would have been that these people were falsely accused, and that it was the result of hysteria.
Oh, really? Even as early as 1830s, they would have understood the concept of hysteria and moral panics. That's interesting.
I mean, my sense is that very soon after the witch trials, you have some participants, say judicial participants, in what took place, who feel guilty and recognize it as a hysteria that did not rest on legitimate evidence. Now, you could find some people, certainly in the immediate aftermath, who wouldn't have agreed with that. But I think by the 1830s, that would have been the clear view of the vast majority of people in Salem and in the rest of the country.
Fascinating. All right, John, thanks for all the color you're able to share. All right, so at some point, Joseph's got to face the saints back in Kirtland, his debts, Kirtland being cash poor. We talked about Andrew Jackson, the National Bank, and banks. Just to kind of be fair in the context of this bank that's about to get started, ultimately failing, not to give the ending away. Lots of banks were failing during this time. Is that correct?
So that's true, but not quite yet. I mean, there are plenty of banks that are always failing, but there's a national bank panic in really the spring of 1837.
Okay.
And that actually post-dates the faltering of the Kirtland Bank.
Okay, so this comes, you're saying the Kirtland Bank fails before there's a big wave of bank failures in 1837.
Correct. Or at least it has substantially faltered by then.
But you're saying that the Bank of the United States was insisting that banks had enough specie to cover, I guess, their debts or whatever, and that was causing a lot of banks to collapse, during this time frame.
Well, so the Bank of the United States had this procedure essentially for rooting out financially unhealthy state chartered banks.
That's a good thing, right?
Well, it's a good thing. It sounds like a good thing. In the mind of Andrew Jackson, it gave
too much power.
It gave too much power, especially, Jackson just had this longstanding feud with the director of the Bank of the United States. And so the Congress attempted to renew the charter of the Bank of the United States in 1832. Jackson vetoed the renewal bill. Right before Jackson, not right before, but in not too long before he left the White House, Jackson issued what became known as the Specie Circular, which required payment for federal land purchases in gold or silver. So that meant that a lot of individuals, they needed to redeem their paper money for gold and silver. That further weakened the banking system. So there was a lot of trouble on the horizon by the time Joseph Smith and his associates started the bank. This then evolved into a more widespread banking panic the following spring.
Okay. And I was going to say, I don't think we have a federal, Bank of America today per se, but then I realized we have the Federal Reserve Bank. So did the bank Jackson was fighting die, or did it just end up evolving into the Federal Reserve Bank that we have today?
So it died.
Okay.
And I believe the Federal Reserve banking system, I believe it was established in the 19-teens.
Oh, okay.
But that's getting a little far afield for me.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Joseph sends some folks to New York to get some plates and a safe, and he's still got to get I assume he wants to create a state bank. So he's got to convince the state of Ohio to approve the Kirtland Banking Society. How does that go?
Well, it doesn't go well at all. So they basically have these plans well in progress, I think, where people are beginning to invest in the bank. And then Joseph sends Orson Hyde, who's an apostle, sends him to meet with the Ohio state legislature. At the time, the state legislature is controlled by what you would call hard money Democrats who just generally didn't like paper money. And so they weren't interested in chartering additional banks. I think in December, when Hyde goes to Columbus, I don't think they vote on his proposal. They're just not interested. By that point, the leaders of the bank, the Kirtland Bank, have already begun printing banknotes. And so it's at that point that they stamp anti in front of bank on some of those notes. The thinking being, they're concerned about operating an unchartered bank.
Which is illegal, correct?
Which is illegal. But then maybe it would not be illegal to operate an anti-banking company.
Okay, a couple things. So first of all, how, in my mind, I'm I would never even buy the safe or the plates, let alone start printing currency until I had gotten approval. Not for any other reason than that I just wouldn't want to waste the money if I didn't have the approval. but there is the also potential problem of getting ahead of yourself in a way that becomes illegal. So how normal do you think it would have been for someone not related to any religion who wants to start a bank? Maybe they've applied, or maybe they've sent some people to talk to the right people, but they just, as a matter of faith and optimism, buy the safe, buy the plates, start printing the currency, even though, is that already foul play, or is that just normal business optimism in your view? Or could you even make that call?
No, it's a great question. So I think it's a little bit hard for us to get ourselves in the mindset of the mid 1830s. So today, if let's say you wanted to start the Mormon Stories Bank, right? And you just started issuing Mormon Stories currency, you'd get in trouble with the authorities really quickly. They would shut it down, right? But in the mid 1830s, it is sort of the Wild West of banking. And there are railroad companies that start issuing paper money. There are people who start unchartered banks. So not everyone chooses to jump through the proper hoops, and rules vary from state to state. In Ohio, I do agree this is risky. There's an 1816 law that threatened individuals who operated an unchartered bank with $1,000 fine, which is a stiff fine at this time. There was also an 1824 law that declared that the notes of unchartered banks were void and therefore worthless. So yes, a more prudent step would have been to try to get approval before going down this road. I think perhaps one reason why Joseph and his associates don't do that is because it's probably easier to get approval if you can convince state legislators that you're sort of legit, in the sense that they have already taken in deposits and investors. They're safe and printing plates, like they're ready to go.
I mean, that's like creating a drug that isn't FDA approved, and you want to apply to get FDA approval. So you just start selling the drug on the market, hoping that by just selling the market anyway, and nobody's complained of dying yet, the FDA will go, well, they've already started selling it, and we haven't heard of any deaths, so I guess we're more inclined to approve the drug now. I don't know. That's probably about an unfair analogy.
No, I mean, I think the thing is, it's the whole world of American banking in the mid 1830s. It is pretty loosey-goosey. Yeah. So the odds that you would necessarily get in trouble for operating an unchartered bank, they're not like they would be in 2025. I do think, however, the fact that they alter some of the notes to read anti-banking company, that just shows you how amateurish this whole effort is. Like this is on shaky ground. And as I said, banking and paper money, they rest on confidence. And so putting notes into circulation that are stamped anti-banking company, that is probably not going to instill confidence. And the reality is, if these notes had only circulated among friendly church members, maybe there wouldn't have been a problem. But of course, people who have these notes, they're going to want to use them to meet their financial obligations. So, church member is going to want to pay his neighbor who's not a member of the church with Kirtland Safety Society notes. And is that individual going to have confidence in them? So, yeah, this is not a well thought through operation.
Yeah, and I have to admit that, for the first 30 years of my life, I didn't know any of this, even though I was raised LDS. When I saw I mean, just imagine everybody, for those who are new to this story, you're reading about this bank that gets started that you were never taught about as a member of the church. And then you learn that they couldn't get the approval fast enough, but they went ahead and printed the currency anyway. And so it said Kirtland Safety Society, and then they stamped the word anti just so that they can keep printing and using money that they do not yet have the permission to use and the approval to use. I mean, that already starts screaming of amateurishness at best, but fraud at worst, because how in the world are they thinking that's going to be okay? That whoever the state or the federal officials who are in charge of making sure banks are approved are going to go, oh, it says it's stamped anti-bank. Oh, no harm, no foul, because you put anti there. Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. Makes no sense.
Yeah.
0 cents.
No,
Negative sense does that make? It's like telegraphing you're doing something really fraudulent. Don't worry, it's not a bank. It's an anti-bank.
Right. Well, and I think they realized this was a bad idea, so they stopped doing it pretty quickly.
Whose idea was it? Was that Joseph's idea?
I don't know. I have no idea. Probably not. It could have been his idea. Could have been Oliver Cowdery's idea. Could have been Sidney Rigdon's idea. It was a bad idea. We can agree on that.
All right. So, but that's where it was. Okay. So what is the price? I read here, you wrote Joseph bought 3,000 shares worth a stated value of $150,000 with an initial payment of $1,342.69. How in the world do you spend $1,300 to get shares worth $150,000?
Well,
like that seems weird. That seems like favorable pricing.
So it is pretty weird, John. So let me take a crack at explaining. So the bank wanted to be able to put, a certain amount of notes into circulation. So I think their first sort of effusion, if you will, of paper money comes from loans that put $10,000 worth of notes into circulation. So they don't have, I don't think they take in $10,000 in investments. I think what they did was they sold shares in the bank, and they sold them for a fraction of their stated value. So in theory, a share was worth $50, but you'd pay like a very small percentage of that to buy in. Now, that doesn't actually mean that suddenly you have, in Joseph's case, it doesn't mean you actually own shares that are really worth $150,000. It simply means the bank takes in a relatively small amount of investment, hopefully a certain amount of silver and gold, probably notes of other banks primarily. And then the bank starts issuing loans. And when it does so, it's loaning out its own paper money. So that's the way it puts these notes into circulation. Okay.
So is that sketchy what he's doing? Is he giving himself favorable pricing or not, in your view?
He's not giving himself alone favorable pricing. Like, in theory, what this means is that whether you're Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, who invests in the bank, or John Johnson, who invests in the bank, what it means is that if the bank really prospered, you would get a fabulous return on your initially small investment. But that return that potential return, that hinges on the bank's success. So it's not as if Joseph puts in 1,300 and gets 150,000 out. That windfall just never arrives.
Okay. And, I was interviewing an ex-Scientologist, and he once accused Scientology of being, basically a corporation masquerading as a religion. What do we make of this idea? Like, I'm sure Joseph doesn't have any money that he actually earns on the side from a store or some side business he's running. Like, all the money he gets comes from members and donations and the generosity of his followers. And then what's it about a church starting a bank anyway? Is this a normal type of thing that churches would do in New England in the 1830s? Would
question.
Churches be intermingling, these types of things, commerce with religion? So
this actually is something that points to the distinctiveness of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. So, by the way, you said Joseph isn't making money on the side. Well, he's trying to. He's also borrowing money for a merchandising operation at the same time. I mean, he also opens a store in Nauvoo. So Joseph actually always has a side hustle. They just never really make him very much money. So technically, this is not a subsidiary of the church. This is formed by a initial group of directors and investors. Now, that's synonymous with the leadership of the church. In general, would other churches do this? No. But I think one of the distinctive things about the Church of Christ, then Church of the Latter-day Saints, the movement started by Joseph Smith, is they are attempting to establish Zion on earth. They are building communities. So they're not primarily trying to spread a religious movement across the country in which individual congregations will build church buildings. They're trying to build communities in northeastern Ohio and Missouri. Now, one of there are sort of two rationales for the bank. Number one, this is going to help Joseph and his associates pay off the debts that they have accrued. Secondly,
for church, for like the temple, right? Like,
correct. Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Not only that, they've also purchased lands in Kirtland and Missouri. So they have a substantial amount of other debts as well. They need to pay off those debts. And they also want Kirtland and by extension themselves to prosper. So people have been moving into Kirtland. Real estate prices are rising. In general, it's a community, and this is common in the United States at this time. It's land rich and cash poor. Now, listeners are probably familiar today with the federal government sometimes trying to encourage economic growth by putting more money into circulation, right? More money, either by spending or perhaps lower interest rates. More money in circulation equals, more economic activity. Well, part of the goal is if you put $10,000 worth of currency in circulation in and around Kirtland, it's going to give the economy a jolt. And actually, for a short time, this seems to work. People are moving in, homes are being built, wages are rising, property values are going up. Church members are writing letters about this in January of 1837. So it seems, for a very short time that this could be a good idea. And then it all goes south really quickly.
Okay. So, and by the way, just for the fun visually, here's a copy of a Kirtland Safety. Here's a visual copy of the Kirtland Safety Society Bank. And it's hard to see, but the anti is stamped really small. It's almost like a hyphen. Like you really wouldn't see it unless you were really looking closely. Is that fair to say, John Turner?
Totally fair to say.
Yeah.
It's a little bit clearer on some of them than it is on your example, but absolutely. And you can see if you're watching this is a note that's signed on January 4th of 1837 by Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. And as I was saying before, if you look, it's a little bit different than if you look at your $1 bill in your wallet. It says, we'll pay $1 on demand to the bearer of the note. And so if you had this, you were entitled to $1 worth of gold or silver.
And it's got a photo of a guy shearing a lamb, bunch of sheep behind him. So I guess he's shearing wool off a lamb. And are those railroads, like the little photos of railroads? There's industry. There's
looks like it
smoke or something. Were railroads existing back then at this point?
They did. Passenger rail was not yet a big thing, but it was a thing. And if listeners are interested, they printed notes in denominations from $1 to $100. They're all quite lovely. So they have, they got nice printing plates. And so the scenes on them are often like bucolic and very pleasant.
They had good graphic designers back then.
Absolutely.
Okay. And again, I'm reading in your book that Sidney Rigdon was the bank's president and Joseph was its cashier. Mm-hmm. I think you've answered this, but was this church owned and run, or was it just so happened that the church's leaders were also running a bank? Like it's shady in the sense that if they're trying to make it look like it's not a church-run bank, it kind of is a church-run bank, unless they're just doing it as a church. And then again, I'm going to ask you, is anybody saying, why is a Christian church running a bank? Is anybody concerned about this at this point?
Yeah. So I think initially people within the church, I don't think there are records of people within the church being concerned. As soon as these go into circulation, people on the outside take note and question this. Not so much. And just to answer your question, it's not a church bank per se legally, but yes, it's a bank run by the leaders of a church. And I do think this next point is important. It's a bank. It doesn't have a state charter, but it's got the Lord's blessing. And I think that's important. I'm not saying that only just tongue in cheek. Joseph explicitly tells people at a gathering in early January of 1837 that he has received the word of the Lord upon the subject of the Kirtland Safety Society. And Joseph, he doesn't just say, I think the Lord is going to bless this project. He says he's heard an audible voice from God. And he assures his followers, there's a customary little bit of hedging here, but he assures his followers that all would be well if they heeded the Lord's commandments. So he very much gives the bank divine sanction.
And what's the benefit to Joseph of clarifying that it wasn't just, he didn't just hear the voice of God, he heard it audibly. What's he doing there, for the confidence and the minds of his followers?
Yeah, I think it's to, clarify that what he's interpreting really comes directly from God. It's not just in his mind.
Was there any doubt? That's really interesting because we've talked a lot about spiritual eyes versus physical eyes as it related to the plates and other sorts of things. I guess it does infer that there was this idea in the minds of people / church members that you could see or hear things with your spiritual eyes, and you could see or hear things with your physical eyes.
Right.
And that there might be some question in their mind. And so Joseph needed to make it really clear to leave no doubt about it.
Right.
It was my physical ears that heard it. Like that also is problematic in the sense, if we think about confidence men, he's trying to use that claim to gain more confidence with the membership. Is that fair?
Well, I think it's totally fair, and it's apt in this case because paper money rests on confidence. If people are confident, if people have confidence in a bank's paper money, then it's stable and secure. If they lack confidence, things can go badly quickly. So yes, Joseph wants church members to have confidence in the Kirtland Safety Society notes. And so I think saying that he heard an audible voice, that's a way of really emphasizing that point. Like, I really heard from the Lord that all will be well.
And these days I'm trying not to really come at the church with a heavy hand. I'm trying to learn objectivity and fair-mindedness from you, John Turner. But when people are concerned about the mix, I've said this before on the podcast. L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, once said, if you want to get rich, start a business. If you want to get really rich, start a religion. I think that's not only because in the United States, religions are often tax exempt, but I think it's also because if you can convince people to give your money and time because you say God says so, that's a lot of undue influence that regular old corporations don't necessarily have the benefit of. So I guess I want to keep asking this question, is it inappropriate for Joseph to be telling everybody that God is sanctioning this bank and that they can feel safe depositing their money there, knowing what's going to happen to this bank, but also I want to read some book on the intermingling of business and religion in the United States, because I want to know how unheard of it is for a bank, for a religion, for a church to be this intermingled in business, as early as the 1830s. Was this remarkable, or were lots of other churches starting corporations and convincing people to follow God by investing in the business? This seems significant, especially in the context today of the Mormon church being worth anywhere between $300 billion and $1 trillion. I think we can see why religion and business can be good partners.
Yeah, I think what I'd say in this case is, maybe the simplest thing to say is, let's, in this case, let the actions and the results speak for themselves, because this is a problem for Joseph Smith, right? He's told church members that the Lord is going to, the Lord has told them that all will be well with the bank. And in a way, he's also, in so doing, he's staking his own leadership on the bank's success. Yeah. And it's very unwise because, and this speaks to the lack of wisdom of the whole enterprise, Joseph ultimately can't control the bank's success.
Yeah. Well, if any of our viewers or listeners know as well, I am dying to know how normal / unheard of it was for a church to get this deep into a business scheme, or if that's normal in the 19th century. You know?
I mean it's not normal.
Okay.
I'm trying. I will see if I can dig up some parallels. I mean, I think historically you could find some parallels, like dating way back. And I'm saying this because I wrote another book on the subject. This is a little bit far afield, but the the founders of Plymouth Colony, they're essentially transplanting a congregation and starting a fur trading enterprise at the same time. And one of the Mayflower passengers, a guy named Edward Winslow, he says that his intention is to make religion and profit jump together. So you could find some other examples, but no, most church leaders are not starting banks in the 1830s. It's pretty much unheard of.
Most people don't know that in the United States today, the Unification Church, I think they own like 50 to 60% of the fish wholesale business in the United States through, I guess, wholly owned subsidiaries of the Unification Church. Like if you eat sushi, there's a greater than 50% chance that it's the Unification Church owned wholesale fish business that supplied the fish for that sushi company. It's kind of crazy when you see how this works. Anyway, very cool, John. Okay, so the bank's going. Now let's just ask about specie. We may be getting ahead of ourselves, but to what this was probably a real death knell for my Orthodox traditional faith when I learned about the specie in the Kirtland Safety Society Bank, or the lack thereof. Do you cover that in your book?
Yeah, no. So this is like I said, things go south really quickly. So they are issuing these notes essentially in early January. By mid-January, you have newspapers in northeastern Ohio who complain about, this Mormon money. And, they make several complaints. They say the Safety Society probably doesn't have the specie or any assets to redeem their notes. Other people notice that they've stamped ante on some of them, which they see as deceptive. And it's tiny, so, you might not notice it. And then they're accused of being illegal, because
it's not approved.
it doesn't have a state charter. And
it never does, correct? It never does.
Never gets one. They make a second attempt to get one in February. But the state legislature, at that point, it does take a vote and they lose. And so here's the thing about banking in the mid 1830s. It's not that hard to topple a bank that's poorly invested. So what happens, as far as we know, is Grandison Newell, who had funded that sort of anti-Mormon information gathering campaign a couple of years ago, he is connected to the Bank of Geauga, so he knows how these things work. He orchestrated a run on the bank by buying up Kirtland notes and taking them to Kirtland for redemption. Basically showing up, or probably sending somebody on his behalf with a fistful of notes saying, give me the gold or silver. And, within a couple of weeks before the end of January, the bank has to suspend specie payments. So at that point, if, say, you had a few $100s in Kirtland banknotes, you'd be pretty nervous that they might not be worth those few $100s. And so the bank is really only on solid ground for a week or two. And, within 3-4 weeks, it's on life support.
This seems like a scene from It's a Wonderful Life, when the George Bailey and the savings and loan, and then Mr. Potter decides he's going to, cause a run on the bank and
Yep.
and bankrupt.
Slam the teller shut, right? That kind of thing, right?
And George is running around the neighborhood like in a panic, realizing that he's ruined. I'm ruined. Jimmy Stewart's, I'm ruined,
Right. I mean, basically, if these notes had only passed among church members, it might have been okay. But this bank is so vulnerable that it's like easy pickings for Joseph's local opponents. I mean, they could do this bank in within a couple of weeks.
I had it written that God and Joseph must have believed in spiritual specie.
Spiritual specie. Yeah.
What do you think?
That's pretty good.
No, but this is, again, one of the most disturbing things. Aren't there reports that if you could go into the bank and go to some place where it would look like they had gold in a big repository, but really it was like fake stuff, like only the top layer would show gold, but there was fake stuff underneath that top layer. So they were literally giving a false impression of how much gold they had on reserves and deceiving people explicitly in that way? Or is that not what you understand?
I don't know. I mean, there are stories along those lines. I don't actually know whether they're true. I don't know how much. I don't think anybody knows how much specie they actually had on hand. They had taken in. Can't remember. So Joseph had invested apparently 1,300. Kind of trying to think what the total amount they took in was. Maybe 5,000 or 10,000 at most. And it's unclear how much of that was in specie and how much of that was maybe in the notes of other banks. I mean, not a lot of church members had a lot of, precious metal on hand. So given how quickly the bank collapses, they clearly didn't have very much in terms of reserves.
Yeah, Julie is looking for the reference, but she's remembering what I remembered, which is literally they had a box full of sand with some layer of gold or gold appearing substance on the top to make it look like it was solid gold reserves. And again, when I read that, and maybe I misread it, or maybe it's the fact that you didn't include it suggests to me that maybe you stumbled on it, but the source wasn't reliable or credible enough to include. Is that something we should maybe assume? Because you do leave no stones unturned, John Turner.
I try not to. So yeah, I just don't know. I don't know how much they had. And I mean, I think this descends into acrimony so quickly that then retrospective accounts, it's a little bit hard to know. What's clear is they had very little specie on hand. And so it wasn't hard for Grandison Newell to basically strike a death blow against the Safety Society within a couple of weeks.
Okay. Well, the quote that I have, I'll share this. I'll share this on the screen. Julie may be able to find something better, but this is from an LDS Discussions episode. The Absurdities of Mormonism Portrayed, a brief sketch by Oliver H. Olney. It says 3rd of March, 1843, as peddlers to and fro from the bank, in with businessmen from different parts of the land, they see themselves in difficulty as gold and silver begin to be scarce. They got a hold of a quantity of boxes and nearly filled them with sand, lead, old iron, stone, and combustibles. That's at least one reference. And again, you're saying it doesn't matter because the bank failed. But I do think that just like the anti-bank scribbling is really clearly problematic, but it's almost comical and transparently fraudulent. But if they're literally creating a box, putting boxes together that have the appearance of money on the top but have sand below, that's outright fraud, and that's another level of a problem versus just not managing the reserves properly in good faith. Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense. So I'll look into Olney's comment and recollection a little bit more afterwards.
Okay.
I would say the two big problems are not enough specie, a lack of foresight. You could foresee that people who don't like Joseph Smith would be demanding redemption. You know, that was a foreseeable problem, I think. Then I think the other big issue that we've already touched on is Joseph is promising people that all will be well, that the Lord has told him that this is going to prosper. And so that, I think, probably was more persuasive to church members than subterfuge with gold and silver. I don't know. It's possible. But I think giving the bank that divine sanction was a big problem, both in terms of inducing people to support the bank at first, but then also staking Joseph's own prophetic leadership to the bank's success.
Okay, and again, don't be mad, John Turner. Julie is looking up sources just because we don't want to give people the wrong impression. There's another book that's called Mormon Portraits, I believe, and in the book it says they went to New York and had notes engraved, beautiful notes, the finest I'd ever seen. In the bank, they kept 8 or 9 window glass boxes, which seemed to be full of silver. Okay, it's silver, not gold. But the initiated knew very well that they were full of sand, only the top being covered with 50-cent pieces. The effect of these boxes, what's that?
I think those would have been silver, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, silver. It says silver.
Okay.
The effect of those boxes was like magic. They created general confidence in the solidity of the bank, and that beautiful paper money went like hotcakes. So like you said, that's how they sold the paper money, was by having people believe that there was silver coins backing up the paper money. Is that right? I mean, theoretically, right, John Turner?
Yeah, that's what is alleged here. Now, I actually would put more stock into Oliver Olney's early 1840s memory than this recollection from Chauncey Webb 4 decades later. I think it's definitely possible.
Okay.
I think we don't know. I don't know that. I mean, there are a lot of people who are really angry about what takes place right in 1837. And there's a lot of accusations going back and forth. Joseph ends up making some accusations against Warren Parrish and Frederick G. Williams of the First Presidency. He accuses them of stealing bank deposits. I think there's so much acrimony on both sides. It's a little bit hard to adjudicate.
Yeah, and that's right. That book is from 1886, so it is a very late source. But it's something that I didn't want people to listen to this episode and not at least know that there were allegations of that sort. And we'll look forward to hearing from you, John Turner, if you learn more. I know that Dan Vogel and others listen to this, and Ganesh. So if any of our amateur or professional historian listeners want to weigh in, if we see any of those comments, we'll share them next time, because we do want to be accurate, for sure. Okay, so the bank starts to implode. The Kirtland Safety Society, which is an ironic name at this point, right?
It is a very ironic name. Yeah, somebody, I don't know if I used the quote in the book or not, but somebody comments on the notes being as good as gold. Not exactly. Right?
But also things get quite unsafe pretty quickly, to the point where what happens to Joseph? What does Joseph do and respond to the scandal?
So a couple of things. So they're desperately trying to stave off the bank's failure. So he sends Orson Hyde back to Columbus to make another attempt at getting a charter. I think even if they'd gotten the charter, it wouldn't necessarily have solved the problem. Then Joseph himself goes to Michigan. And
he leaves, he runs away. Is that fair to say or not fair to say? Or he's trying to buy the other bank. That's right.
Yeah,
okay, go ahead. Yeah.
He buys another bank.
Does he actually buy it?
He apparently acquires a controlling interest in
Bank of Monroe.
Bank of Monroe, which is chartered in the state of Michigan. The problem was, as I point out in the book, the Bank of Monroe itself is on the verge of collapse, which is why he's able to acquire a controlling interest so easily. So basically, merging two really shaky banks, that's not helpful.
I mean, one anti-bank and one actual bank.
Right.
But like that almost seems as kind of sophisticated. If you can't get a charter, go buy a failing bank to get your charter and merge the banks. That almost sounds sophisticated.
Right. Well,
but it doesn't work because the Bank of Monroe fails. Is that why?
Yeah, exactly. It's itself on shaky ground. It has to suspend specie payments in March. I mean, again, so the heart of banking in the mid 1830s, the heart of banking really at any time is confidence, right?
Yeah.
If let's say you've got $50,000 in your savings account, and we'll just leave out like the FDIC. Let's say, you get wind that your bank might collapse. You're going to go there because your confidence is faltering and you want to get your money out as quickly as possible. And it's very hard to reestablish confidence in something that is failing. I mean, I think the only solution would have been some massive, infusion of specie, some solid investment in the Kirtland Bank, and nobody was in a position to do that. And certainly no one who had the means would have wanted to do it.
Was that a fundamentally deceptive act to go try and buy an existing bank to get a charter? Because basically it's going to try and create the impression that they have approval when at that point they knew the bank was imploding, right? It would have given people a false impression, wouldn't it have, or not?
Maybe. I think in part it's hard to know if they're trying to do that to save the bank. It's probably not going to work. Because people didn't lack confidence in the Kirtland Bank because it lacked a charter. They lacked confidence in it because it lacked specie.
Yeah.
So it may have been an attempt to avoid possible prosecution for operating an unchartered bank. In that sense, maybe it could have been a decent workaround. I don't know.
And then you mentioned, as I think you mentioned earlier in this episode, that timing couldn't have been worse because then a broader bank failure wave hits the United States. Is that right?
So the Panic of 1837 is essentially the failure of scores of banks across the country. I think mostly starting in the spring of 1837, and it turns into essentially a bit of a national financial meltdown and economic depression. Now, I'm being a little precise on the timing because the Kirtland Bank doesn't fail because of this widespread panic. Like the Kirtland Bank fails for locally specific reasons. Now, it makes it, I'm sure it created additional challenge in terms of trying to solve this problem. It was a difficult time.
It didn't help.
Generally, didn't help, but it's not the reason why the bank.
Yeah, because apologists will often say that. They'll often say, "Don't hold it against Joseph or God." They won't say God. Don't hold it against Joseph, because banks were failing all over the place. But what you're saying is, the Kirtland Safety Society failed because it wasn't set up properly to begin with, and the wave of banks that failed later failed for totally different, totally unrelated reasons. And the Kirtland Safety Society's bank failed unconnected to all the other failures in that wave of the panic of 1837, right?
You got it, John DeLint.
Okay.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay. So Joseph and the Lord don't get a pass is I think what we should conclude from that.
Yep.
Maybe. Okay. So Joseph's response after fleeing the state, or going to Michigan or whatever, it seems like his response to the scandal, his next response to the scandal, is to hold a solemn assembly. Why in the world would that be his next step?
Well, that's a good question. I think really they're simply reprising the solemn assembly from the year before. And I don't actually think it's necessarily connected to the bank. It is sort of a mini Pentecost as opposed to the major Pentecost of the year before. But, the year before, Joseph's talking about the situation in Missouri. This time at the assembly, when Joseph is sermonizing and speaking, he talks about the banking crisis. And he wants to reassure them that Kirtland has a glorious future. Essentially, if the saints continue to support the church, bring themselves and their money to Kirtland, he's confident he and other church leaders will be able to settle their debts and the town will flourish. But it's pretty clear that the failure of the bank is irreversible by this point. Sidney Rigdon notes in a meeting that many of the church had refused Kirtland currency. So, church members are no longer even accepting these notes from other church members. They're that shaky.
Is it kind of irresponsible for Joseph to hold a solemn assembly, which denotes God and Jesus and divine approval, and then tell them, according to your book, if the saints brought their money to Kirtland, the church's debts could be settled and the town would flourish? That's almost basically saying, hey, saints, the failure of the bank is up to you, but also implying that God wants them to put their money in and save the bank. Am I reading that wrong?
I don't think you're reading it totally wrong. Now, first of all, why is Joseph saying this at the solemn assembly? Well, Joseph's giving a sermon to this large congregation. He can't really avoid the elephant in the room. I'm sure by, early April 1837, and this has probably been the case for 2.5 months, all anybody in Kirtland's talking about is the bank. And so Joseph needs to address it. Now, in a way, it may be unfair, but he's not wrong to say that the success of the bank hinges on church members' faithfulness. Because it is true, if all church members had kept their confidence in these banknotes and had continued to circulate them, the bank might have been able to pull through. The problem is, it's really hard to restore confidence in a failing bank. And, people are wise to that. They're everybody's nervous.
I mean, how long would it have taken that bank to become solvent? Let's just say everyone kept their, money in the bank. The bank would have still needed to become a solvent institution, right?
Yeah. Well,
could that have ever happened? Ever?
No, I think it was hopeless because also Joseph's opponents, they were pretty shrewd. All they had to do was, let's say you're Grandison Newell and you, John DeLynn, you've got some Kirtland money. Well, you're a little uncertain about it, but you've got $100 of Kirtland currency and you're worried it could be useless. Well, Grandison Newell is going to come along and say, well, I'll give you $50 for it in Bank of Geauga notes. You're going to be thrilled. So you're going to make that deal. And then he's going to try to redeem them for gold or, the bank from the start was vulnerable to a run. And Joseph created circumstances that made himself and the church vulnerable to their enemies.
And it does seem like another example of blame reversal, like we mentioned in Zion's camp, for kind of members to be given the impression that they were the ones to blame for the failure of the bank. Because clearly it was a fraudulent, I don't know, do you like the term fraud, or do you feel like fraud doesn't apply because it was created with good intentions?
So in this case, I would say it was mostly unwise and amateurish, and it was illegal. So those three things. I mean, I don't think Joseph's intention was to defraud church members. I think he wanted the bank to prosper, and I think he hoped that he would prosper and the community as a whole would prosper.
Right. But if it's true that they had faked the appearance of actual specie and deposits, that's fraud, right?
Of course, that would be fraud.
Okay. So it gets to the point where someone accuses Joseph of threatening to kill them. That surprises me. That seems pretty shocking. Do you want to tell that story?
Sure. I don't know a lot of detail about it, but Grandison Newell, again, who's one of the directors of the Bank of Geauga, and now he's been an active opponent of Joseph Smith for a few years. He swears a complaint before a justice of the peace that Joseph had threatened to kill him. A court apparently acquitted Joseph of the charge. In a way, it reminds me of Joseph's complaint against Philastus Hurlbut from a couple years earlier. I don't know. Joseph easily could have said something at a gathering. I'm sure he's really steamed at Grandison Newell for orchestrating this run on the Kirtland Bank. So if he said something about, wanting to kill Grandison Newell, doesn't mean he was actually planning to kill him.
But for you, it's possible. It's within reason that Joseph did threaten to kill someone.
Yeah, and it may have just been a stupid, angry comment.
Okay. And then again, things get so hot that what does Joseph decide to do again?
So what is essentially going to happen from this point forward, this is April of 1837, for the next 9 months, this financial crisis creates a situation in which Joseph's creditors sue him for payment, and he is constantly under duress from creditors and from sheriffs who are essentially supporting the complaints of his creditors. So he has no peace until he flees Kirtland for the last time early in 1838. So he's frequently on the run. He's frequently out of town.
Is on the lam a fair thing to say?
Oh, he's on the lam because I think at first he's evading. He's evading arrest and a hearing on that charge of threatening to kill Grandison Newell. And then a lot of the time he's trying to evade sheriffs who want to arrest him on charges pertaining to his debts. It is constant trouble for Joseph Smith until he clears out of Kirtland for the last time.
Is this the most legal trouble he's been in since his treasure digging days? I'm trying to remember. Or did things get really bad for him in Missouri during the Zion camp stuff? I'm trying to remember.
So this is the most legal trouble he's in until in the aftermath of the Missouri Mormon War.
Okay, so that's to come.
Yeah, it's
okay.
It's mostly debts, and then later on, this he's charged with illegally operating an unchartered bank, and that also creates a big legal problem for him.
And it's kind of 10 years past his legal troubles in Pennsylvania, right?
Correct.
Okay. So it's all right. So you write that Joseph receives word from was it from Hiram that Kirtland isn't safe? Is that right?
Yeah.
And so he goes to New York to hang with an old friend, Martin Harris.
Yep, he goes to spend a little time with Martin Harris in Palmyra. Now, Harris is often in Kirtland, so I don't know if they perhaps made the journey in tandem. It's not clear to me, but Hiram basically warns Joseph, don't come back to Kirtland too quickly. It's too dangerous.
I'm wondering if in the Articles of Faith it says that the Mormons believe in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. That's one of the Articles of Faith that Joseph publishes at one point, I believe prior to this event. I might be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But is it honoring, obeying, and sustaining the law to be fleeing the arms of justice when you know that you're in trouble for breaking the law?
So that's a great question. I don't know if I really want to weigh in theologically. I think what I would do is I would try to separate instances in which Joseph has really done wrong and deserves to be held to account legally, and situations in which Joseph's enemies sort of take advantage of circumstances to afflict him legally. Now, let me just give you an example. Back in the fall of 1830, Joseph Smith Sr. Gets thrown in a Canandaigua, New York jail for the failure to pay a really small debt. So that kind of thing can happen. And, what would be typical is usually a creditor doesn't want to throw somebody in jail. They'll give them a little bit more time to pay. For Joseph Smith, once things start going south in Kirtland, almost all of his creditors put the screws on him. And so he's really under legal duress. Now, I do think later in the year, he and Sidney Rigdon get charged and actually convicted in absentia for having broken Ohio laws against unchartered banks. And I think that's fair. They operated an unchartered bank. What can you say? In some of these other instances, Joseph's creditors, they're taking advantage of his weakness and putting the screws on him.
But is it, I guess I'm asking, in an 1830s context, is it dishonorable to intentionally flee the law when you know the law is trying to arrest you?
That's a good question.
I guess if you think you're being unfairly or unjustly persecuted by the law, you could feel like you have moral grounds to resist arrest.
Well,
But I'm imagining Joseph didn't feel like he was being falsely accused here.
well, no, I think he does get acquitted of threatening to kill Grandison Newell. So he probably does feel like he's being falsely accused. Let me give you another example. And I'm not trying to apologize for Joseph's behavior in all of these instances, but in Nauvoo, Joseph frequently evades arrest because if he's arrested, he's going to be extradited to Missouri and he thinks he's going to get killed. Now, I don't really fault Joseph for trying to avoid that circumstance. What I think is a real problem in 1837 is once the bank starts to fail, everybody in Kirtland seems to turn on each other. And Joseph fails to provide steady leadership for the church during these months. I'm sure Joseph has some creditors who unfairly afflict him. I'm sure in some cases he should have simply, faced the charges. I think, again, I would say Joseph has almost throughout this whole episode, his behavior is erratic, uncertain, and once things begin to fall apart, Joseph's behavior certainly doesn't do much to stem the bleeding.
Okay. I was feeling sad for Emma because at this point, I guess they have 3 children. And I'm thinking Emma's just left alone to take care of 3 children while Joseph's constantly fleeing. But you write that there are 20 people living with Emma in Emma's house.
Yeah.
It almost feels like, I think I was thinking of like Gilded Age or Downton Abbey. Yeah. Like, why are so many people living with Emma?
I mean, they do have their own house now. And so, I don't know. I don't have all the names, but there's Joseph's parents. There's the 3 children. There are people boarding with them. There's some hired help. There are often visitors. So I don't know if there are always 20 people in this Smith home, but apparently, at least at one point, there are 20 people there. And, Emma very much feels left in the lurch. She writes Joseph, "Everybody has so much better right to all that is called yours than I have." And creditors are trying to essentially get legal attachment to property in the house to settle Joseph's debts.
Yeah, and you mentioned the creditors were really angry. What is it? Give us a sense for how it really hurts people. Like, yeah, I think that's something we're not really talking about here. Joseph starts a bank. He did it as a fool's errand. It obviously wasn't professionally run. How does it actually hurt people in their lived lives that this bank was created so irresponsibly and run so poorly and ultimately fails?
Yeah.
How does it hurt people?
Great question. So one example I give in the book is Parley Pratt, pretty famous name to people familiar with early Mormon history, and probably not someone that people think of as frequently at odds with Joseph Smith. But in this case, it's the bank and also this real estate bubble in Kirtland that for a time puts Parley Pratt at odds with Joseph Smith. So Joseph, I don't know if this is maybe late 1836, early 1837, he sells 3 properties to Parley Pratt for $2,000. And there's a down payment of $75. And, these days, if you buy a house, you usually do it with like a 30-year mortgage, for $2,000, you'd be paying what, $10 a month for a long time. I forget the exact terms of this arrangement, but payment schedules were usually pretty steep. So I think Pratt maybe owed a big payment 6 months later or something like that. And Joseph, when he comes back to Kirtland in mid-May, he's got this debt, that Parley Pratt owes him, and he turns it over to the Kirtland Bank. And then Sidney Rigdon, as an officer of the bank, demands payment from Pratt. Now, what Pratt says is, look, I don't have whatever it is at the time, $500, $1,000, maybe the full $2,000. Can I just give you the properties back that I bought from Joseph? And Rigdon says, no, you can't do that. You owe me the money. And he demands Pratt's house as payment. And Pratt is just steamed about this. And he's steamed because he also knows that Joseph himself, he had bought these properties for something like $100. So this bubble has created this, this sort of crazy situation. And Pratt apparently tries to meet with Joseph, can't get an audience with him, writes him a blistering letter in which he blames Joseph and Sidney for leading this people astray through false prophesying and preaching. And Pratt says that Joseph had made a sacred promise that Pratt, this is a quote, would not be injured through the land transaction. And now Pratt is facing ruin. And I think there are a number of situations like that. Joseph had promised people that everything would be well. And now people are putting the screws on him. And at least in this instance, he in turn is willing to put the screws on Parley Pratt.
What does it mean to be ruined in the 1830s? What does that even mean?
That's a great question. So number one, the loss of his house. In theory, if you couldn't meet your debts, you could be thrown in jail.
So he'd become potentially homeless and potentially go to jail. That's pretty serious.
Potentially. I mean, maybe it wouldn't have gone quite that far. But, Pratt, obviously, he's beside himself at the prospect of losing his house. But I think his basic complaint is that Joseph has been acting like a false prophet.
Yeah, and so on the one hand, I'm thinking, finally, somebody holds Joseph accountable for his prophecies not coming true. On the other hand, I don't know a lot about Parley P. Pratt, other than he's a name you hear a lot being raised in the church. But I assume he stays faithful past Joseph's death. So even this doesn't end Parley P. Pratt's faithfulness to either the church or Joseph.
So, yeah, I mean, for a stretch of time, he's disaffected. Then I think he and Joseph mend faces a couple of months later. But a lot of people, there are a lot of people who temporarily lose their faith in Joseph, but there are others for whom, this is it. President Frederick G. Williams of the First Presidency, Warren Parrish, Lyman Johnson, John Johnson. I don't know how familiar the Johnson family is to listeners. They were stalwart supporters of Joseph Smith. Joseph was living in their home when he was assaulted and tarred and feathered in March of 1832. They were wealthy. Their property and wealth during these years had been sort of a financial backstop for the church. So that was a big deal. By the end of the year, Martin Harris he had his ups and downs with Joseph Smith, but and this is not like the end of his association with the church, but he's sort of on the outs by the end of the year. So this is a really, really tough pill for a lot of church members to swallow.
And again, Rigdon is kind of like Joseph's bulldog with Parley, right?
Right. Yep.
What happens there?
So Rigdon basically is the one who puts the screws on Joseph. So Pratt essentially owes Joseph nearly $2,000. And so Joseph turns that debt over to the bank to collect. I think it might have been a move that helped Joseph settle some other debts. I'm not quite sure. But Rigdon then basically tried to collect on Pratt's loan. And of course, Pratt couldn't come close to paying. I assume one way or another, because Joseph is able to work things out with Parley Pratt, they must have found some way of settling the dispute.
Yeah. And that's where just business and ecclesiastical leadership, that's really ugly. And some of the apostasies I've seen in my lifetime are just people where bishops or stake presidents or general authorities got involved in shady business deals using their religious or spiritual influence, and things just always get messy. So there's some who just say religion and business kind of shouldn't mix, and it certainly went bad for Parley. And at one point, the Kirtland High Council tries to meet, and what happens?
So that doesn't really, at that point, you get just a sense of paralysis. So, charges are just going back and forth. Let's see. So Lyman Johnson and Orson Pratt, who are both apostles, they send a charge, basically an accusation to Bishop Whitney, accusing Joseph of lying and misrepresentation, for extortion, for speaking disrespectfully against his brethren behind their backs. And then Joseph's supporters bring charges of their own against some of the people who are now basically dissenters. Kirtland High Council met in the temple to discuss these charges. Joseph doesn't even show up. The council apparently just dispersed in confusion. So that basically you had financial chaos lead to ecclesiastical chaos.
And modern members of the church would have a hard time imagining members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles kind of in open revolt and accusation against the president of the church. But that's what was happening, right?
Yeah. So you have at least 3 apostles who are I think 4 by later in the summer, who are at odds against Joseph. A member of the first presidency, Oliver Cowdery, a second member of the first presidency, who's also increasingly disaffected. So things are seriously going off the rails.
And when the Kirtland High Council tries to meet, your book says Joseph just didn't even bother to attend. Is that right?
He did not attend. And I'm sort of interpreting that as, at that moment, he did not want a direct public confrontation with his enemies. Now, also
with his enemies or with his leadership,
right? I mean, it's basically, everything is falling apart.
With his fellow leaders of the church. Wait, enemies. Okay, sorry. I don't mean to laugh. But I mean that Kirtland, I've heard it referred to as the largest apostasy that the Mormon Church ever faces.
No, I think that's true. Because it's such a high percentage of people really at the top who get disaffected.
And these are Zion's camp participants largely, right? So, okay. So what does Joseph do in terms of ownership in the bank to try and put this all behind him?
Well, he just heads for the exits. So he transfers all of his own safety society shares to a couple of church members who are faithful to him. A lot of individuals withdraw their shares in the bank. Joseph and Sidney Rigdon resign as officers in the bank, leaving it in the direction of Warren Parrish, Joseph's former scribe, who's now an antagonist. By this point, Joseph himself condemns the bank. He condemns the speculators, renegades, and gamblers who are its remaining operators. That beautiful $1 banknote you showed earlier in the episode that would now have been worth pennies on the dollar. Although I will just point out, John, if you held on to these from the 1837 forward, they're now worth thousands. So
yeah, I was going to ask, not because of the specie though, right?
No, good long-term investment.
Just because they're rare documents, right?
Right. And they're kind of quirky and fun.
Do you own any?
No. One of my goals in life is to acquire Mormon money.
Well, I'm sure there's some viewers or listeners that are going to be FedExing you something that they own.
I'll pay pennies on the dollar.
Okay, so yeah, Joseph and Sidney abandon it, and then Joseph gets sick. Like that is that? I mean, that's legitimate illness. Like, what is that? Psychosomatic distress?
Who knows? Let's just presume he's legitimately sick. But I think it really adds to the sense of crisis. So I have this detail. While Joseph is sick and possibly on his deathbed, people aren't sure, Parley Pratt is standing up at a Sunday morning meeting in the temple, announcing that Brother Joseph Smith had committed great sins and that, lots of people have departed from God. And apparently it's the first time since the temple has been completed that a Sunday meeting ends without the celebration of the Lord's Supper. So, I mean, it's the level of rancor, and you alluded to it with the pistols and Bowie knives at the outset. I mean, the level of rancor just reaches a fever pitch in the summer of 1837.
But also, you write that saints were fasting and praying for Joseph's well-being. So in some ways, at least with some, he's able to turn this into him being the victim. Is that right?
Well, I mean, let's just presume he actually is the victim of this virus.
Because he's sick.
Right. So, yeah, no, I mean, there are, of course, this is not just everybody turning on Joseph. This is, in a way, the church being divided over what has transpired. So, of course, Joseph still has some stalwart supporters.
Talk about the confrontation between Fielding and Joseph, because Joseph still had some fight in him, right?
Between Fielding and Joseph?
Let's see. You talk about a confrontation. You said, with Parley. You said Joseph remained formidable. When he met his critics face to face, he could often persuade or cajole them into contrition.
Right. So, yeah, I think that actually is one interesting thing about Joseph's leadership during these months. And we've already alluded to the fact that he's sort of in and out of Kirtland. And especially when he's absent, rancor very much grows and people are expressing a lot of bitterness toward him. But I've noticed, whether it's Parley Pratt or whether it's Thomas Marsh and David Padden, who hear that Joseph has committed adultery, when Joseph gets face to face with many of his detractors, he is able to persuade them either of his own righteousness or of their own errors. I think perhaps this speaks simply to the strength of his personality. A lot of people, when face to face with the prophet, backed down.
Yeah, very, very a powerful, charismatic presence, right?
That's my interpretation.
Yeah, but ultimately Joseph flees, right? He flees the county.
Yeah, I mean, again, he's in and out, partly because the he is still under constant duress from creditors, and also I think he does just want to clear out. I don't think it helps the situation in Kirtland, but in late July, he and Sidney Rigdon decide to visit branches of the church in Canada. And basically, anytime they go through Painesville, Ohio, there's a sheriff there who detains them for a failure to pay debts. And Joseph, in these instances, would either try to settle the debt or post bail to pledge a later appearance in court. Apparently, in one of these instances, so there's a sheriff in Painesville by the name of Abel Kimball, no relation to Heber C. Kimball, as far as I know. Apparently, one time Joseph is passing through Painesville, and the sheriff leapt into his carriage, seized him in the reins, and basically handed him a writ with some sort of complaint. Joseph just hands over his watch on the spot to try to pay a debt. I mean, it's pretty crazy.
It reminds me when Warren Jeffs was on the lam, the federal government was going after him. There were reports that he had just bags of money, and he was basically just riding around in some car in the back seat, paying cash with everything until he finally was caught. Like, it gives those types of vibes of him he's got money, he's on the run, and it's just a matter of time before he ends up in jail.
Well, yeah, and then you alluded to this story at the outset, which I rather like. So he's gone to Canada, and then he's coming back, and they're headed toward Kirtland, and apparently he and Sidney Rigdon disguised themselves because they don't want Sheriff Kimball to bother them as they pass through Painesville. But apparently, when they get 4 miles from Kirtland, they're arrested. They're brought back to Painesville. Joseph fears that, he might be assaulted the way he was back in 1832. Sheriff Kimball keeps the two of them at a tavern owned by a member of the church who basically lets them slip out the kitchen door. And Joseph and Sidney flee into the woods, and they have enemies pursuing them, and they take refuge in a swamp and lay down next to an old log.
A log, right? A log.
A log. And I like this detail that Joseph tells Sidney to try to breathe more quietly if he doesn't want to be caught. And I have to think Joseph can say that with a bit of a chuckle or a smile, at least. And their pursuers don't find them, and they basically go through cornfields for a while. They get back to Kirtland shortly before dawn. And then this is classic Joseph Smith. I mean, whether you love Joseph Smith or hate Joseph Smith, he has some impressive moments of bravado. So after all this, it happens to be Sunday, and he goes to the temple, and he speaks apparently in a very powerful manner. And the congregation is sort of impressed. Like, this guy is kind of hard to keep down.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and it's got to be the type of stuff that makes people like you and others just so interested. We already mentioned at the beginning of this episode that things get so out of hand back in Kirtland, that in the Kirtland Temple, swords are drawn, guns are drawn, people are jumping out of windows, there are Bowie knives, there's a melee. Any report of injury or death occurring in the temple?
So that's a great question. I think some reports of minor injuries, but
No stabbings or shootings.
no stabbings or shootings. It seems like people are basically ready to come to blows with each other, but don't quite. I do think by September of 1837, Joseph is starting to recognize that it might not be tenable for him to stay in Kirtland. His properties clearly at risk. He has all of these extensive debts. He doesn't seem to be able to go anywhere without getting arrested. It's going to make it kind of impossible to conduct church business. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that in the fall of 1837, Joseph decides to visit Missouri. So he takes this trip to Missouri.
Wait, can I just say,
yeah,
I mentioned that him being in a disguise before. It does note in your book that Sidney and Joseph disguised themselves, and they were in the company of Samson of Ard. Wasn't he? Doesn't he end up being one of the Council of 50?
No, he is involved with the Danites.
Oh, the Danites. That's right.
Yeah. So
okay, so they were in disguises at one point.
Yeah, I don't know what the disguises were. Okay. It's a reference. I think it's a reference from a letter, either Violet Kimball or Mary Fielding, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
Apparently, they're not very good disguises because they're spotted.
Okay. And then it's also worth noting, even though last episode we talked about Fanny Alger, that all of this scandal is primarily the Kirtland Safety Society imploding, but there is the layer of some of Joseph's colleagues and leaders knowing about the Fanny Alger adulterous affair and being upset about that as well, correct?
Correct. Right. So it seems that Thomas Marsh and David Padden, they're discussing this with Warren Parrish and Oliver Cowdery. Now, it's possible, I'm just going to speculate, if it hadn't been for the Kirtland Bank, it may well be that the Fanny Alger affair or rumor may have been something that Joseph could easily have overcome. But I think you have the circumstance in which a large number of people, including high-ranking leaders of the church, are actively questioning Joseph's leadership. And you'd have to think that provides a lot of oxygen for the Fanny Alger rumors.
And again, Joseph denied that he had an affair with Fanny. He made sure she was run out of the state. And he bullied anyone that made that claim to him. So he was deceiving people. He was covering it up and denying that affair. Is that unfair to say?
Well, Joseph absolutely denies that he's committed adultery with Fanny Alger. And that's absolutely true. And, there's this one report that this is Brigham Young's recollection that when David Padden challenges Joseph on the issue, Joseph slapped him in the face and kicked him out of the yard. So, yeah, Joseph is not interested in being challenged on this point.
And Julia's trying to nuance it and say that he denied that it was an affair, which implies that maybe he thought it was polygamous and that God was okay with it?
That's not my interpretation, because I simply don't think, yes, it's possible that Joseph simply thought that God had sanctioned some sort of intimate relationship with Fanny Alger. I don't think Joseph has developed his theology of sealing yet. So I would read it simply as Joseph denying intimacy with Fanny Alger.
Okay. Okay, so you mentioned that Joseph just decides he comes back into town on December 10th, but at some point he realizes he's just got to flee the state, right?
Yeah. So what happens is while he's in Missouri, he is tried and convicted in absentia, along with Sidney Rigdon, of violating the 1816 law against unchartered banking. And by the way, the mechanics of this are actually pretty interesting. The statute, the law, mandated $1,000 fine, half of it going to the state and half of it going to the individual who brought the complaint. Grandison Newell, who'd orchestrated the run on the bank, also orchestrated the lawsuit. So he can then pursue legal actions to collect the debt. And what happens is he basically gets the sheriff, I think again it's Sheriff Abel Kimball, who is Joseph's least favorite sheriff ever, I think. He's basically going to attach all of Joseph's property, and eventually he would take his house in order to pay this debt. So once Joseph is facing that $500 fine, besides the ecclesiastical chaos, it's just untenable for Joseph to stay, at least without individuals coming forward to help him financially.
And does that earn Joseph the label of a convicted criminal then, or not? Is that too harsh, or is that just descriptive?
I think that's just descriptive.
Okay, so he, by this point, he is a convicted criminal, and he flees the state to avoid punishment.
Well,
correct?
So, sort of. I mean, his property is attached in order to pay the fine. It's a fine. And so what happens is the sheriff in early January, I think you can see this in a newspaper, basically announces a fire sale. Joseph's assets are sold in order to pay his debts, including furniture, the church's printing press. He also seizes and sells Joseph's Egyptian materials, including the mummies and papyri. Now, apparently, some church members either bought them on Joseph's behalf or reacquired them. So Joseph's able to retain possession of the papyri and mummies. Joseph had tried to shield certain things from being sold, like the Kirtland Temple. But according to Violet Kimball, the profit is basically stripped of everything, even food and clothing. So it was only a matter of time before the sheriff came and sold Joseph's land and house. And so Joseph dictates a final revelation in Kirtland. And Jesus puts it pretty clear. Get out of this place, or there shall be no safety for you. So Joseph's property was in danger. It's probably fair to say that on some level his life might have been in danger, given the level of ecclesiastical rancor. And so Joseph flees on horseback, I think at night. And Emma and the family soon join him, and they begin a journey west to Missouri.
Yeah. So not a good outcome. And as far as the folks that remain, the apostles and church, well, does this ruin for good Joseph's relationship with Oliver Cowdery?
Pretty much. So basically what Joseph does in December when he gets back to Kirtland is he publicly states at a meeting that Cowdery has confessed to lying about him. And Cowdery then, he's irate by that. And he says, unless you take it back, Joseph, we are parted, or something like that. And, Joseph doesn't take it back. So yes, they never overcome their breach after this.
And again, from Joseph's perspective, how is Oliver the bad guy?
Well, from Joseph's perspective, or at least what Joseph maintains, is that Oliver Cowdery is falsely accusing him of adultery.
But also, I guess Oliver wasn't happy about the bank, right?
I don't think Oliver was. I'm sure he wasn't happy about the bank. I will say, as far as I know, their breach was mostly about Fanny Alger rather than the bank.
I kind of have a picture of Oliver grinning the whole time this bank thing's going down. Just sort of saying, yeah, like that's who we have as a leader. Did it affect Joseph's relationship with Sidney? Because Sidney was basically Joseph's partner in the failed bank, right? Yeah.
No, it doesn't affect Joseph's relationship with Sidney. So, once, and we'll see in the next episode when, a lot of these problems follow Joseph to Missouri. Joseph gets away from his Kirtland creditors, but, problems of dissent within the church persist. Sidney Rigdon is loyal. He resolutely stands with Joseph against his critics in 1838.
What about the Whitmers? Did this affect his relationship with the Whitmers? And I read at the top of page 202 that there were 30 excommunications. Who's getting excommunicated and why?
So, a lot of people. So the Whitmers aren't excommunicated yet, but David Whitmer and John Whitmer and Frederick G. Williams, they are at odds with Joseph by the fall of 1837. Also, apostles Luke Johnson and John Boynton, Martin Harris and Warren Parrish, also. Apparently, the 30 excommunicated individuals include Harris. I think that's not absolutely clear whether he's formally excommunicated or not. I don't know. I'd have to look up the list. A fair number of the high-profile individuals are actually excommunicated the following spring.
But these are apostles and top leaders of the church, right?
Oh yeah, no. This is absolute serious sort of ecclesiastical civil war by the second half of 1837.
And if you had to kind of summarize why Joseph and whoever is still loyal to him are excommunicating dozens of top church leaders, it is because?
Well, I think it's because through the debacle of the Kirtland Bank, a large number of church members conclude that Joseph is a fallen prophet. And like I said before, I think one reason for that is people had, well, I have to think this through as I say it. I mean, I think there are quite a few times where we've seen Joseph stake his prophetic authority on a particular outcome, and it doesn't always come to pass. And in this case, Joseph says that God has told him that all will be well with the bank. And so people believe him, and they stake some of their money and economic fortunes on the Kirtland Bank. Now, when we're talking about something like Jackson County or the failure of Zion's Bank, Zion's March, not Zion's Bank. That's a different bank. It was easy for the saints not to blame Joseph because at the end of the day, it was anti-Mormons in Jackson County who were responsible for the persecution and expulsion of the saints. In this instance, certainly enemies have something to do with it, but it's really easy for people to blame Joseph and other church leaders for this debacle. There's not really anywhere else for Joseph to point the finger. Now, he does do that to some extent. He accuses Warren Parrish and maybe Frederick G. Williams of stealing bank deposits. But as far as Joseph's opponents in Kirtland are concerned, this is on Joseph Smith. It's not on anybody else.
Yeah, if ever there were credible grounds for someone being denounced as a false prophet, one might think the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking scandal would qualify.
Absolutely. So, according to Apostle Thomas Marsh, who's still loyal at this point, maybe wavering.
And he's the milk strippings guy, right? That the church used to claim he apostatized for being mad over not getting enough milk or something.
Correct, which I think is not true, but we'll talk about him next episode. According to Marsh, the dissenters, they claim themselves to be the old standard and called themselves the Church of Christ. They saw Joseph as either a fallen prophet or a liar from the beginning, whom God had nevertheless used to bring forth the Book of Mormon and the earlier revelations. You actually get a similar response of some dissenters in Nauvoo. They see Joseph as a fallen prophet, but, they converted to this church for a reason, and they don't want to totally disavow that.
Yeah, the Nauvoo expositor with William Law seems to make similar charges later. Really quickly, I seem to recall Grant Palmer in his book, An Insider's View of Mormon Origins, saying that it was during this whole Kirtland Bank fiasco that Martin Harris maybe introduced again, or for the first time, the idea that he didn't see the plates with his physical eyes, but instead saw them with his spiritual eyes. Does that ring a bell? Was it tied to all of this? And if so, why would Martin be talking about physical eyes versus spiritual eyes in the gold plates at this particular moment in time?
Yeah. So great question. I think that quote, about Harris making that comment, I think it's from either 1837 or 1838. I don't remember the exact source off the top of my head. I do think, though, it's probably not coincidental. Harris is among those who have lost faith in Joseph's leadership by the end of the year. So it stands to reason he'd be a little bit more critical or self-critical of some of his earlier experiences. He's not permanently disaffected. A few years later, Parley Pratt reported that Harris was still in the church. So he may not have been formally excommunicated, or he may have been cut off and then regained his fellowship, or still had some faith in the church.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I can imagine people saying, well, Joseph can't have always been a false prophet because you saw those gold plates in the angel, Martin. And then Martin could say, well, I saw him with my spiritual eyes. I mean, that's how I'm constructing a possible dialogue, but I know that's just my own construction, but I'm just trying to figure out what the context might have been.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite possible that because of these reversals of fortune, Harris is hedging his bets a little bit more by this point.
And then you said there was an actual fire. Was the Kirtland Temple on fire?
Not the Kirtland Temple, the Kirtland printing office. Okay. So that is among the properties that are sold to settle Joseph's debt. And soon after it is sold, it burns down in the middle of the night. I think the day after it's sold. And it does scorch the exterior of the temple, but the temple doesn't burn. And it's understood to be arson. And suspicion falls on a few men who were sympathetic to Joseph. Oliver Cowdery's brother actually dismisses the charge. He's a justice of the peace. But it seems that Joseph supporters are upset that the printing office has been sold, and so they burn it down. I don't think that's definitively certain, but seems possible.
It seems sad that, or outrageous, that so many people lost so much money in this bank. There's a little bit of collateral offered to try and offset the losses. And so Joseph's supporters want to destroy what little collateral is even available to offset the losses. That seems just downright dirty.
Yeah. I mean, if that's the case, yeah, I think it was.
And then Emma's pregnant to add on top of all of that. Apparently Emma's pregnant.
Yeah, this is not the first time she's moving in difficult circumstances. So I think if you recall, when they moved to Kirtland initially, I think she was getting toward the end of an earlier pregnancy, and now she's in the second trimester of another pregnancy. And actually, they have a pretty arduous wintertime journey to Missouri ahead of them.
Yeah. Well, I guess in an ideal world, Joseph could have just stood up and instead of excommunicating dozens of his followers, fleeing justice, in an ideal world, he would have said, "Hey, I shouldn't have started that bank. Yeah. I'm really sorry that so many people lost their money. You know, you're right. You know, follow fellow apostles and Book of Mormon witnesses and church members. I misled you. I'm sorry. I should have done this. I'll submit myself to justice and do my best to spend the rest of my days and years making this right for all the people that I'm hurt." But Joseph kind of sets a precedent here for how the church handles harm and scandal that it's involved with. Is that fair to say?
So I actually like I really like the first half of your comment. I'm not saying I dislike the second half. I just haven't thought about it as much. You know, I think this is just sort of, it's not like I always live this out perfectly, but in general in life, if you make a bad mistake, I do think the best recourse, I don't mean that it's always the best recourse politically or, you know, in some other way, but I think the best recourse is to say, yep, I completely messed up. Maybe explain, this is why I did it. My intentions were good. I thought this would benefit us. We can recover from this, right? If we all stick together, the fact that this bank failed, this doesn't have to be the end. You know, let's find other ways. It'll be hard, but let's pay off our debts and we can hang in there with each other. I think in this case, as things unraveled, you know, Joseph didn't find a way to take responsibility for at least his part in it, and therefore could never stem the bleeding. And the only recourse that he eventually found was to clear out and start over in Missouri. And I do think this is, you know, just it's an example of poor leadership on Joseph's part. And you know, the irony is, this is right on the heels of one of Joseph's most signal successes in Kirtland, and then it all just falls apart within a year.
Yeah, and it, you know, when Dallin H. Oakes, the current president of the church, made that statement that the church neither offers nor seeks apologies, in some sense, he's kind of just describing the precedent that Joseph set. Joseph didn't really seem to apologize, at least publicly, for the trouble he got himself and others into. And so I think if the church leaders, if the LDS Church has that position today, that it just doesn't apologize, it kind of is just doing, in essence, what Joseph did. Because if ever there were a point where Joseph and the church could have apologized, it would have been 1837 Kirtland, correct?
I think so. I don't know if it's the example that most needed an apology, but yeah, I mean, and I think on a human level, for Joseph had some real strengths in the sense of when he failed or encountered failure, he was super resilient. He would come back stronger, but he wasn't great at humbling himself and saying, I messed this up. And, he could even have said, I think, the Lord wanted us to do this. And, it turned out it was just impossible circumstances. Our enemies had it in for us. I'm sorry. I know this has cost some of you a lot of money. And I think a lot of people would have been forgiving of that. But I think Joseph's choice instead was he wanted to blame everybody but himself for the bank's collapse. And I think people understood that on some level, a lot of this was on him.
Yeah, and the thing that always makes me most sad is when people that are hurt are the ones that are punished or blamed. And that's the collateral damage. But then again, like if we're just looking at a macro level, look at where we are in the book. So like we're completing chapter 18. Joseph begins his Kirtland time, 1831? Is that right? When Joseph first comes to Kirtland?
Correct.
Like that's 6 or 7 years where he starts out coming into Kirtland with just hundreds of members.
Yeah.
And where does this leave Joseph in terms of his prophetic mantle, his prophetic power? Because even though Joseph leaves Kirtland in scandal and in what would be seen as failure, this is not by any means the end of Joseph. And if you were to count his power and his following, it's quite significant by 1837, right?
Well, it is. And I think
we have not seen the last of Joseph.
Oh, no. Don't worry, dear listeners. We have quite a few chapters to go. And, the most exciting chapters, I think, are yet to come. I think for Joseph, practically speaking, his leadership in Kirtland is just, it just doesn't function anymore by the end of 1837. He is able to regroup in Missouri, but problems from Kirtland follow him in part because of these unresolved conflicts with people like Oliver Cowdery, David and John Whitmer. Joseph isn't able to really, I would say, fully regroup until he establishes Nauvoo.
Yeah. And you would include Martin Harris in that list as well, right?
Well, Harris is no longer, he's not really in Joseph's orbit at all after this. So this probably is an unresolved conflict, but it's not an active one. Yeah.
All right, John Turner. Well, what this could be its own movie, right? Just the Kirtland, Safety Society Bank fiasco. Someday they're going to either create a movie or a multi-season series on all of this history because it's fascinating. So thanks for bringing it to life for us, John Turner.
You are welcome, John DeLynn. Crazy stuff.
So what do we have to look forward to in our next episode?
Missouri. It's that we're going to have plenty to talk about next week.
You're titling it East of Eden. That's got Steinbeck references. That's my favorite Steinbeck book.
Excellent.
All right. Well, John Turner, thanks so much for your generosity today We really appreciate your book and all you do. Again, the book is Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet by John Turner. Please buy it. It's a great Christmas gift. Buy it for you. Buy it for your friends and family. I think this book, buy it for believers. Do you get good feedback from believers about this book, John Turner? Or do you even hear from believers about this book?
I have gotten quite a few emails from active Latter-day Saints who have enjoyed the biography. I mean, I like to think, and you often say that I give Joseph a fair shake. Now, not everybody reading the book agrees with that. I like to hear from people, honestly, whether they agree with my interpretations or not. I appreciate people reading and engaging. I think, we have a lot of evidence for Joseph Smith's life, but we have plenty of things that are open to interpretation and debate, which I always welcome.
All right. Well, we really appreciate it. We're 21 episodes in, and I imagine we've got at least 10. How many more to go? At least 10 or 20 more to go? I don't know.
We'll keep rolling along. I think we've got another 10 or 12 chapters.
Okay, so at least another 12. But thank you for your generosity. For those who have donated, we couldn't do this without you. We are paying John Turner not nearly what he deserves. So if you want to donate financially, half of all donations are going to go to John. And so if you want to thank him for his work, you can go to donorbox.org/Joseph Smith, become a donor to this series. Thanks to everyone who donates to this series and also to Mormon Stories. We couldn't do it without you. All right, John Turner, you take care, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks. See you soon.
And thanks for joining us today on Mormon Stories, everybody. Give us your feedback, email us, comment on these episodes. We really love your feedback, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Take care, everybody.